Hey, how's it going, guys? And welcome to part 8, in which we are going to be creating the fire animation. And this one is going to be a bit more complex than the ones we've been creating up until now, and that's because we also have to animate the gun rig. So basically we are going to be animating the bolt and also the trigger of the gun. So to start setting this up, let's, as always, go back to the idle pose. And let's duplicate this one and call it fire. And then we can switch into pose mode with the character rig selected and select the gun. And when it comes to creating a fire animation, I usually start with moving the gun back on the first frame. So just moving one frame ahead and then moving it back on the Y location axis. Like that. And then what we can do is we can copy the first frames, so the idle pose, and duplicate them with Shift D and then just move them forward a bit. And this gives us like a good base to start working from. So if we play it now, we can see that we have a very basic fire animation going on. But obviously we're going to have to add a little bit more detail to this one. So I'm just going to jump into the graph editor and start tweaking the Y location a little bit. And also duplicate the last keyframe here to give us some more frames to work with. And I think I'm going to try and go for a more like a snappier style of animation with this one. So I'm going to try and make it feel a bit faster. So what I did here is on the first frame, I moved the gun back, and then on frame 4, well, it's like between 3 and 4, I move it back to the initial location. And then I also added some kind of like bouncy movement here at the end, so it doesn't look so stiff. And I'm just going to add one more at the end to smooth it out even more. And we can try some different variations to see how it could look. And especially for this gun, we're most likely going to be shooting very quickly in the game. So it's going to be like an automatic weapon, so it's going to be firing quickly. So it's a good idea to keep this kind of subtle so it doesn't like pop around all over the screen when you're shooting quickly. And we can actually try that by lowering the end frame to like 5 or maybe 7 or something. So we can just see kind of like a preview of what that would look like. So I'm actually going to lower this a bit. I think that's a bit too much. Then I'm just going to increase the length again. And then I'm going to add some Z Z location changes here in the graph editor. So I'm going to try kind of moving it down initially. Let's get a better angle here. Just to make it look a bit more interesting and add a little bit of variation to it, so it's not just back and forth. And then also filling in with some detail here at the end. And spacing them out a bit more. And we can also add some rotation. So I'm going to copy some X rotation keyframes here that we can work with. And then I'm just going to hop into the graph editor again and start tweaking these. And I'm using Control left click to add new keyframes in the graph. So you don't need to actually copy them in here. You can also just hover over the curve and then press Control left click to add a new one. And I'm also going to try inverting this to see how that would look, if we can get a nicer result. Kind of like that, but something feels a bit off. I'm not too sure about that. I think we can work with this kind of look here. Just some slight rotation, nothing too crazy. And I'm also going to increase the Y a bit more. And I'm also going to copy some Y rotation keyframes and start adding in that as well. To give it like a little bit of a shaky movement. Usually looks pretty nice. I was going to tone these down a little bit so they're not too crazy. And I'm also going to go back to the X curve here and tweak it a little bit to see if we can get some different results. All right, and finally, I'm also going to add some Z keyframes for the rotation. And I mean, again, doing the same thing, going back to the graph editor and just tweaking them a bit and seeing what results we can get from that. So I usually like to add in these kind of, what would you call them, like basic curves here. Just this is like my typical curve setup, and then I just tweak them based on that. And then I kind of scrub through the animation to see if I need to change them anyway. All right, I think that looks pretty good. Got a basic fire animation. And the next step is that we want to actually animate the weapon rig itself, because I want to move the bolt back, and I also want to move the trigger when you're shooting. So to do this, we can first go into object mode and then select the gun rig. And by default, this one has the reference animation that we created in the first part. So I'm just going to duplicate this one and call this one WEP assault rifle. Actually, I'm going to call it FP_WEP assault rifle fire. And in this case, this stands for first person, and this is our, like, I guess, internal naming convention, but we usually call the weapon animations _WEP, just so we can tell them apart from the character animation. And now I have to kind of check on which frame I want the bolt to open. And this is usually either immediately or on the second frame. In this case, I will do it on the first frame. So with the weapon rig selected, go to pose mode. And then I'm just going to select the bolt here and simply drag it back. And I know that the bolt isn't really visible on the weapon. I mean, you won't be able to see the bolt opening. So this part is more for the sake of explaining how to do it if you ever need to animate something on the weapon. And I'm going to keep this one open for one frame, and then I'm going to copy the default pose here and move it 2 frames behind that. So it stays open for 1 frame and then closes over 2 frames. And now if we play it, we can see it in action. Looks pretty good. And I'm also going to do this for the trigger. So I'm going to select the trigger bone. And on the first frame here, I'm going to fully rotate it back all the way. And do the same thing as we did for the bolt. So now it stays pushed back for 2 frames. And then over 2 frames, it moves back into its initial position. And again, you can't really see it in from the camera view here, but it's good to know. And as a final step, I also want to animate the trigger finger. So I want the character to actually pull the trigger. We can actually select both of the rigs. So select the gun rig and the character. And then with both of them selected, we can go into pose mode. And this way we can actually animate both of them at the same time without having to go into object mode and then select and then pose mode. So we can actually speed up that process a little bit. And to animate the trigger, I'm just gonna basically match the finger with the same motion that we animated on the trigger. So on the first frame, the trigger moves back. So I'm just gonna animate the finger to also move into like a pushing, pulling the trigger pose here. So I'm gonna move the finger back slightly, just rotating it. And since the trigger is being held for 2 frames, I'm gonna duplicate the finger bones here, or the keyframes, and move them 1 frame ahead. And then I'm also going to copy the default pose and move it 2 frames behind. So this way it moves back with the trigger. So it's pushing it and then moving back. And now if we check out the full thing, you can see that the trigger is being pulled and the bolt is opening. Cool. And finally, I'm also going to add some slight camera animation. I'm not going to go too crazy with this one. I'm just going to add some rotation on the y-axis. So I'm going to copy the Y rotation keyframe here on the camera and move it up a little bit. Copy a few of these as a base to work on. And then in the graph editor, I'm just gonna start tweaking them. We have to zoom it out a little bit. And now we can see that the camera is rotating. And again, we want to keep this kind of subtle. It shouldn't really take over the whole animation, which can be a bit tricky sometimes. And I usually notice that it looks slightly different when you export it into an engine. So it's probably a good idea to come back later on and tweak these animations based on how it looks in engine. It might look fine in Blender, but then when you play it in engine, it's like too much or too little. So there will be some slight differences like that. That's a bit too much. Gonna just tone it down slightly. And there we go. Got some camera rotation to make it feel a bit more powerful. And I'm just gonna move these a little bit. And I think that's pretty good. I'm happy with this this fire. And now that we have the base fire animation here, we're also going to be creating an aimed fire. And the reason we're creating 2 fire animations is because the aimed version has to be a bit more stable so that you can actually aim through the iron sights while shooting. Which is why we're creating 2 versions. So to do that, I'm just going to copy our current fire and rename it to fire_aimed. and make sure you save that. And then I'm also going to copy all the keyframes from the aim pose. So just going into the aim pose for a second and selecting all the keyframes by pressing A and then Control C. And then I'm going back to the fire aimed animation. And I'm just going to paste all of these keyframes on the first frame in this case. So make sure you select one of the bones first, like this, and make sure that it's expanded, because otherwise it's only going to paste that specific bone. So select one of the expanded bones and then press Ctrl V, which moves it into our aim pose. And now we can see that the gun is going back to the default position again. So to fix that, we go into the gun bone keyframes and basically just match all the keyframes to the aimed version. For the X location, we can actually delete these because I don't think I animated any of them. So I'm deselecting the first keyframe, and then I'm dragging this up to match it. And then I also want to copy the first keyframe and place it on the last, so that we can get a matching end frame. And I'm just going to do this for all of the axes. So copying the first keyframe, placing it on the last, and then also adjusting the curve so it fits better. And I think the rotation is the same by default. So that's all good. So deselecting the first one, then moving it down so that it's aligned. And then copying the first one and placing it on the last. And now we can also check if it's matching by going to the first frame and then the last frame. And yep, it seems to be matched perfectly. And now if we play it, we're going to see that it's a bit too intense for the aimed version. So like the sights are going all over the place. So it's a bit too crazy. And we can fix that by selecting the entire curve. And then you can either use this built-in tool, which you can access by pressing Alt and D. And then you can use, I think it's called Blend Offset. Nope, not Blend Offset. It is called Blend to Default Value, I think. Okay, so this is the one. And you can use this one to basically decrease the intensity of the curve without having to manually move each keyframe. So I'm just going to lower this a bit so that it becomes a bit more stable. And I'm also going to do this for the other rotations as well. And I'm also going to do this for the Z location. For this one, I'm going to manually adjust it because it didn't seem to work with the blend to default. So I'm just going to manually move these down and scale them a bit as well. I'm going to preview it to make sure that it looks good. I think the Z rotation is still a bit too high. And perhaps also the Y location or rotation is a bit too high. And that's actually pretty good. It's stable and it allows you to still aim through the sights while shooting, which is good. So I'm gonna move the X rotation a little bit to kind of stabilize it even more. And maybe even move it back a bit more on the Y location. And there we go. That's our aimed fire. So these are usually a bit quicker to make since we can base them on the default animation. And now I also want to add a marker for the end frame here. So I'm just gonna check that it's matching on both the fire animations, which it is. They are the same length. So in this case, it's ending on frame 23. That's where the last keyframe is placed. So I'm going to add a marker on 23 and rename it to end_fire. And then we can also set the timeline to 23. And now we can start exporting these. So as we've done up until now, you copy the name of the animation. And then in object mode, you select only the character rig. So not the weapon for now, just the character. And then you go to File, Export, and FBX. And I already have the correct folder selected by default. And for the settings, as usual, we have selected objects, armature, only deform bones, bake animation, and key all bones, and force start end. And then we can just paste in the name and hit export. And we're going to do the same for the normal fire. So just copy the name again. Go to export FBX and paste it in and export. And since we also animated the gun for this one, we are going to have to export the gun animations too. And in this case, the process is basically the same. So instead of selecting the character, we are going to select the gun rig and copy the name. And before we export, we actually have to disable the constraint. So this one. And the reason we have to disable it is because if we don't disable it and just keep the gun in this position, the animation will actually be exported from this position. So when we import to Unreal Engine, the pivot point will basically be here on the floor, but the gun will be kind of floating on top of it. So to fix this, we simply disable this for now by pressing the little eye icon. And the left hand will move down with it, which is fine. We can ignore that for now. And with the gun centered, we again copy the name and then go to export, FBX, and use the same settings as before. And then we just paste that in and export it. And since we already exported the entire gun rig with the mesh, we don't have to worry about that now. We just need to export the actual animation data so that we can import it into Unreal Engine. And now we can enable this again and just restore it to the way it was. And that's it for the fire animations. So we have the aimed version and the normal version. I hope that was useful and made sense to you. And when you feel ready, you can move on to the next video, which is the reload animation. And that is going to be the most complex one so far, which is also why I saved that one for last, because it is the most difficult one to create. So yeah, I'll see you in the next video.